On a freezing Christmas Eve, Margaret stumbles upon 6-year-old Elsa, shivering alone on a park bench, waiting for a mother who promised to return. But as danger looms in the form of a menacing stranger and dark secrets unravel, Margaret is thrust into a desperate quest to uncover the truth. How far will Margaret go to protect a child who isn't her own? The wind howled like a feral beast, flinging snow across the empty park. Frost clung to the rusting iron of the park bench where Elsa sat, her tiny frame dwarfed by an oversized coat that hung from her shoulders like a shroud. Her legs swung slightly, boots too big for her feet scraping the icy ground. In the distance, the glow of Christmas lights spilled from warm houses, a sharp contrast to the dark, unwelcoming night. Margaret pulled her scarf tighter around her face as she trudged through the storm, clutching a bag of grocery. She hated this kind of weather, the kind that reminded her of the winters when there wasn't enough heat, enough food, or enough love to go around. Tonight was supposed to be different, a quiet evening, just her and her old cat, Benny. Then she heard it, the faint sound of crying barely audible over the wind. Margaret stopped mid-step, her heart lurching. She squinted into the darkness, her breath fogging the air. At first, she thought she'd imagined it, but there it was again, a soft, keening wail that cut through the night like a blade. Margaret followed the sound, her boots crunching against the snow. That was when she saw her, a small figure huddled on the bench, her dark curls plastered to her face with snow. Elsa's tiny hands clutched the edges of her coat, fingers blue and trembling. "Sweetheart?" Margaret called gently, lowering her voice to avoid scaring the child. She knelt down, her knees sinking into the snow. "What are you doing out here? Where's your family?" Elsa blinked up at her, her wide brown eyes swimming with tears. "Mama said she'd come back," she whispered, her voice raw and cracked. "She promised." Margaret's chest tightened. She reached out, placing her hands over Elsa's icy fingers. They felt like brittle twigs beneath her touch. The coat she wore bore a frayed tag from a local shelter. "This coat," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "Did someone give it to you at the shelter?" Elsa nodded faintly. "Mama took me there, but she had to leave. She said she'd be right back." The sharp whistle of the wind filled the silence between them. Margaret's eyes darted around the deserted park. No signs of anyone, just the two of them and the storm closing in. "You can't stay out here," Margaret said firmly. "You'll freeze." Elsa pulled back slightly, clutching the coat tighter. "But Mama said—" "I know," Margaret interrupted softly. "We'll wait for her together, okay? But first, let's get you warmed up." Elsa hesitated, her tear-streaked face full of fear and confusion. Finally, she nodded. Margaret lifted her, the little girl weighing almost nothing in her arm. As they made their way to Margaret's apartment, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was deeply wrong. A mother leaving her child alone in a storm? It didn't add up. The apartment was small and sparsely decorated. Margaret wrapped Elsa in every blanket she could find, lighting a fire in the old wood stove. She warmed some milk, urging Elsa to drink as she rubbed warmth back into her hands. The child's shivering subsided, and she began to doze off on the couch, her fragile body curled like a kitten. Margaret watched her for a moment, an ache blooming in her chest. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She froze, her pulse quickening. The knock came again, louder this time. Margaret approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood there, his face shadowed beneath a hood. "I'm here for the girl," he said, his voice gruff. Margaret's stomach flipped. "Who are you?" "I'm her father," the man snapped, his tone clipped. "Open the door. She's coming with me." Margaret hesitated, glancing back at the sleeping child. Something about the man's stance, his harsh tone, felt off. "Do you have any proof you're her father?" she asked, keeping her voice even. The man's expression darkened. "Open the door, lady, or I'll make this difficult for you." Margaret's hands trembled, but she stood firm. "I'm calling the police." The man's eyes narrowed and he took a step back. "Fine," he spat. "But this isn't over." He turned and disappeared into the snow, leaving Margaret staring at the door, her heart pounding like a drum. Behind her, Elsa stirred, her voice small and frightened. "Is Mama back?" Margaret swallowed hard, her resolve tightening. Not yet, sweetheart, but we're going to find her, I promise. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the weight of a promise she couldn't break. The snowstorm had thickened overnight, transforming the streets into a labyrinth of white. Margaret bundled Elsa in layers of scarves and gloves before they ventured out. She couldn't shake the encounter with the man from the night before. His words, his tone, had left her unsettled, and she didn't believe for a second that he was Elsa's father. But she needed answers, and the shelter's tag on Elsa's coat was the only clue she had. The wind whipped at their faces as they made their way to the shelter, Elsa holding Margaret's hand tightly. "Do you think Mama is waiting for us there?" Elsa asked, her voice tinged with a fragile hope. Margaret forced a smile. "We'll find out, sweetheart." The shelter was a modest brick building, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. A worn banner reading "Safe Haven Shelter" hung above the door. Margaret pushed it open, ushering Elsa inside. The smell of soup and coffee wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. A middle-aged woman with a kind face approached them. "Welcome. Can I help you?" Margaret nodded, guiding Elsa forward. "This little girl, she was given this coat here. Her mother, do you remember her?" The woman's brow furrowed as she studied Elsa. "What's your name, sweetie?" "Elsa," the girl whispered. Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "Yes, I remember her. Her mother brought her in a few days ago. She seemed troubled. She kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her." Margaret's stomach sank. "Did she say where she was going?" The woman hesitated. "She didn't, but she left in a hurry carrying a suitcase. She asked for directions to the bus station." Elsa clung to Margaret's side, her face crumpling. "She's not coming back, is she?" she asked in a trembling voice. Margaret knelt down, brushing a stray curl from Elsa's cheek. "I don't believe that for a second. Your mama loves you. We're going to figure this out." The shelter worker handed Margaret a small notebook. "She left this behind. Maybe it'll help." Margaret opened it cautiously. The pages were filled with hurried handwriting, notes, reminders, and fragments of thoughts. One line leapt out at her. "He found me. I need to protect Elsa." Margaret's breath caught. "Who's he?" she murmured to herself. The woman at the shelter spoke quietly. "If her mother was in trouble, it's possible she was fleeing someone. You should be careful." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. "Thank you." As they stepped back into the snow, Elsa's grip on her hand tightened. "What's in the notebook?" she asked, her eyes wide. Margaret hesitated. "It's just some notes your mama wrote. She was thinking about you." Elsa looked down, her lips quivering. "I want to go home." Margaret crouched to meet her gaze. "I know you do, but we have to be brave for a little while longer. Can you do that for me?" Elsa sniffled and nodded. "Okay." They turned toward the bus station, hoping for answers. The snow crunched beneath their feet, the city eerily quiet in the storm. The bus station was a cavernous, echoing space. A handful of people lingered on benches, their faces drawn and weary. Margaret approached the ticket counter, holding Elsa close. "Excuse me," she said to the clerk. "Did you see a woman here a few days ago? Medium brown skin, dark curly hair, carrying a suitcase?" The clerk frowned, tapping at a computer. "Maybe. A lot of people come through here." "She would have had a little girl with her," Margaret pressed, "but she left the child at a shelter." Recognition flickered across the clerk's face. "Yeah, I remember now. She bought a ticket for a bus headed south, but she left before the bus even arrived. Seemed spooked." Margaret's shoulders tensed. "Do you know where she went?" "No idea," the clerk said, shrugging. "But she was asking about a hotel nearby. Maybe she stayed there?" As Margaret turned to leave, her eyes caught a figure watching them from across the station. It was the man from the night before, his hood pulled low over his face. Her pulse quickened as he started toward them. "Elsa, stay close," she whispered, gripping the girl's hand. The man moved faster now, his intent clear. Margaret scanned the station, her mind racing. She spotted a security guard and shouted, "Help! That man is following us!" The guard turned just as the man reached them. He grabbed Margaret's arm, his grip like iron. "Give me the kid," he growled. Margaret yanked her arm free, shielding Elsa. "Who are you? What do you want?" "She doesn't belong with you," the man hissed. The guard approached, his hand on his radio. "Sir, step back." The man glared at Margaret, his eyes cold and unrelenting. "This isn't over," he said, before disappearing into the crowd. Margaret's knees felt weak as the guard escorted them to safety. Elsa buried her face in Margaret's coat, trembling. "Who was that man?" Elsa whispered. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but I promise I won't let him hurt you." As they left the station, Margaret felt the weight of the notebook in her pocket. Whatever was happening, Elsa's mother had been running from this man, and now he was after them. They had to find her before he did. The snowstorm showed no mercy as Margaret and Elsa trudged through the icy streets. Each step was a struggle, but Margaret's resolve was ironclad. Her mind churned over the fragments of the journal, the woman at the shelter's warnings, and the relentless man at the bus station. Whoever Elsa's mother was running from, he was dangerous, and now he was after them. Their destination was a small, run-down motel a few blocks from the bus station. Margaret had called ahead to ask if anyone matching Elsa's mother's description had stayed there. The clerk's vague confirmation, maybe hard to say, was the only lead they had. The motel loomed in the distance, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow. Margaret tightened her grip on Elsa's hand. "Almost there, sweetheart," she said, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled of mildew. A disheveled man behind the counter eyed them suspiciously. "You the one who called?" Margaret nodded. "Did you see her? A woman, medium brown skin, dark curly hair. She would have had a suitcase." The clerk shrugged. "Yeah, I remember. She came through a couple nights ago. Didn't stay long. Checked out before dawn." Margaret's stomach sank. "Did she say where she was going?" "Not to me," the clerk said, then added, "But she left something in the room. Cleaning staff found it after she left." He rummaged under the counter and pulled out a small, battered envelope. Figured she'd come back for it, but she didn't. Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a crumpled photograph of Elsa and her mother, smiling on what looked like a summer day. On the back, written in rushed penmanship, were the words, "If anything happens, find Margaret Turner. She'll help." Margaret's breath caught. Her name, her address. Elsa's mother had known her, or at least known of her. But how? "Mama knew you?" Elsa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her mind reeling. Before she could process the revelation, the door to the lobby slammed open. The man from the station stood in the doorway, snow swirling around him, his gaze locked on them, and he strode forward with chilling determination. "You can't run forever," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Margaret instinctively pulled Elsa behind her. "Who are you? Why are you after this child?" "That's none of your business," he snapped. "Hand her over or I'll make you regret it." Margaret's heart pounded as she glanced around the room. The clerk was frozen, clearly out of his depth. There was no time to call for help. She had to act. "Run, Elsa!" she shouted, shoving the girl toward the back door. The man lunged, grabbing Margaret by the arm. She twisted free, her elbow connecting with his ribs in a desperate move that sent pain shooting through her own arm. "Get away from us!" she screamed. Elsa hesitated, her wide eyes filled with terror. "Go!" Margaret shouted again. The child bolted toward the exit, disappearing into the snowstorm. Margaret tried to follow, but the man blocked her path. His grip tightened on her wrist, his face inches from hers. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he hissed. "Then explain it!" Margaret shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The clerk, shaking behind the counter, had managed to call the police. The man released her with a snarl and darted out the door, vanishing into the storm like a shadow. Margaret staggered outside, her lungs burning as she called for Elsa. Panic clawed at her chest as the snow obscured everything. "Elsa! Elsa!" Finally, a faint voice answered, trembling and afraid. "I'm here!" Margaret found her huddled behind a dumpster, her small body shaking violently from the cold. She wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her tightly as relief washed over her. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice cracked. "You're safe." But deep down, Margaret knew they weren't safe. Not yet. Whoever that man was, he wasn't going to stop. And Elsa's mother, wherever she was, held the answers they desperately needed. As the police arrived and took their statements, Margaret felt the weight of the photograph in her pocket. Elsa's mother had trusted her. But why? And more importantly, how could she honor that trust when the danger was closing in? For now, they had a small reprieve, but the storm still raged, both outside and in Margaret's heart. Tomorrow they would have to face it head-on, one way or another. The first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the motel blinds, painting the room in pale gold. Margaret hadn't slept. Elsa lay curled on the bed, her breathing even, though her small hands still gripped Margaret's coat like a lifeline. Margaret stared at the photograph of Elsa and her mother, her mind circling the unanswered question. How had Elsa's mother known her, and why had she entrusted her with her daughter? The knock on the door jolted her. Margaret froze, her heart racing. She edged toward the door and peered through the peephole. Relief and suspicion tangled in her chest when she saw the two uniformed officers standing outside. Their presence brought both a sense of safety and the fear that they'd misinterpret her role in this mess. She opened the door cautiously. "Good morning, officers." "Morning," one of them said, his breath fogging in the cold. "We've been looking into the incident you reported last night. We believe the man who confronted you might be linked to a larger investigation. Can we come in?" Margaret hesitated but nodded, stepping aside. Elsa stirred as the officers entered, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Margaret knelt beside her. "It's okay, sweetheart. These people are here to help." The officer's voice softened when he addressed Elsa. "Hi there, Elsa. Do you know the man who was after you and your mom?" Elsa shook her head. "He was scary. Mama said he was a bad man." The officer turned to Margaret. "We think he's connected to a trafficking ring we've been tracking for months. It's possible Elsa's mother got caught up in it. She might have been trying to escape when she left her daughter at the shelter." Margaret's blood ran cold. Her journal said something about protecting Elsa. "Do you think she's still in danger?" "It's likely," the officer admitted. "But we found a lead at the bus station. Someone matching her description was seen boarding a bus to a nearby town. We're following up on it now." Margaret stood, a surge of determination rising in her. "I'm going with you." The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, this could be dangerous." "She left her daughter with me for a reason," Margaret interrupted. "I'm not abandoning her now." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then nodded. "All right, but stay close." The bus depot in the neighboring town was small and grim, its benches occupied by weary travelers. Margaret held Elsa's hand tightly as they followed the officers inside. The clerk at the counter confirmed that a woman matching Elsa's mother's description had bought a ticket to a nearby shelter. The officers radioed ahead, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken as they piled back into the car. When they arrived, the shelter was a simple building surrounded by barren trees. Inside, a group of women and children sat huddled near a heater. Margaret's eyes scanned the room, her heart leaping when she spotted a familiar figure in the corner. "Elsa's mama?" she whispered. The woman turned, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. When her eyes landed on Elsa, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Elsa! Mama!" Elsa cried, breaking free from Margaret's grasp and running into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, sobbing. Margaret felt her own tears threaten as she watched the reunion. She stepped forward, her voice soft. "I'm Margaret. You left my name and address in your notebook." The woman looked at her, realization dawning. "You're the one who took care of my baby. Thank you. I didn't know where else to turn. I'd heard about you from someone at the shelter in our old neighborhood. They said you were kind, that you'd help." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm just glad you're safe." The officers approached, their expressions serious. "Ma'am, we need to talk about the man who's been after you." Elsa's mother nodded, her arms tightening around her daughter. "His name is Martin. He's my ex. I left him when he started threatening Elsa. He's dangerous." One officer stepped aside to make a call, and the other said, "We'll ensure he's taken into custody. For now, you're safe here." That evening, back at Margaret's apartment, the three of them sat around a small table. Margaret had pulled together a modest Christmas dinner, store-bought rolls, canned soup, and a tiny chocolate cake. The fire crackled warmly, filling the space with a sense of safety and comfort. "Thank you," Elsa's mother said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Margaret smiled gently. "I think we've all been through enough to know that sometimes we just need someone to help us stand." Elsa giggled, breaking the heavy moment. "It's Christmas. "We should sing." The two women laughed, and for the first time in days, the fear and tension ebbed. They sang softly, their voices blending with the crackling fire. Outside, the snow had stopped, the world blanketed in quiet peace. As Elsa drifted to sleep in her mother's lap, Margaret felt a deep sense of purpose settle in her chest. The storm had passed, but their bond, born in the cold and fear, would last. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment. What moment moved you the most? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.